The interrogation lasted 3 days. Not 3 hours. 3 days. A man who had traveled across the Pacific Ocean, weeks at sea, in steerage, on a ticket that represented years of saved wages, sat in a wooden detention barracks on an island in San Francisco Bay and answered questions. The same questions, repeated across multiple sessions, put to him by inspectors who already had a file on him. A file that contained the answers his family members had given to the same questions, in separate rooms, without the ability to compare notes. The questions were specific. How many steps lead up to the front door of your family home in China? What direction does the main door face? How many water buffalo does your neighbor keep? What are the names of your father's brothers, in order of birth? Tickets. If his answers matched the file, matched the coaching papers his family had prepared and memorized before he left, he would be admitted. If they did not match, he would be deported. Between 1910 and 1940, the Angel Island Immigration Station processed approximately 1 million arrivals through San Francisco Bay. The station was the primary port of entry for immigrants from Asia, from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, India. It was not Ellis Island. Ellis Island processed arrivals in hours, sometimes days. Angel Island detained arrivals for weeks, sometimes months. The record shows cases exceeding 2 years. The physical station opened in 1910. The legal architecture that made it a detention facility rather than a processing center had been in place since 1882. That gap, 28 years between the law and the building, is where this story begins. C2. Here is what the legal architecture actually was before the station was built to enforce it. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law to restrict immigration on the basis of race and national origin. Its language was specific. Chinese laborers were prohibited from entering the United States. Chinese merchants, teachers, students, and diplomats were exempt. The distinction between a laborer and a non-laborer was not self-evident. It was a determination made by an inspector on the basis of documentation that the applicant was required to produce, in a system that was not designed to make that determination easy. The Exclusion Act did not create Angel Island. It created the conditions under which Angel Island became necessary, a physical facility capable of holding large numbers of people for extended periods, while their eligibility was adjudicated by a bureaucratic process that had no fixed timeline and no guaranteed outcome. The exempt categories were real. Chinese merchants with documented business interests in the United States could enter. American-born citizens of Chinese descent had constitutional birthright citizenship. And, critically, the sons and daughters of American citizens, including American citizens of Chinese descent, were themselves citizens by derivation, entitled to entry regardless of the Exclusion Act. This last category is where the paper trail becomes most specific. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed the city's municipal birth records. Every birth record, for every resident, of every origin. The implications for immigration enforcement were immediate and precise. A Chinese-American man whose birth in San Francisco could no longer be documented by a city record could claim citizenship, and the government had no paper to contradict him. He could then travel to China, return with a son, a real son, or a slot sold to an unrelated young man, and that son could enter the United States as the citizen child of a citizen father. The slots were called paper sons. The system that produced them was not a fraud invented by immigrants to deceive a neutral bureaucracy. It was a rational response to a law that had foreclosed legal entry for an entire population, and to an earthquake that had eliminated the documentary infrastructure that law depended on. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of navigating an immigration system designed to exclude you using the documentary gaps that the system itself had created is not a condition unique to Chinese immigrants in 1906. It is the operational description of what happens when legal exclusion meets human movement. The documentation becomes the battlefield. The paper becomes the border. Most people tracing a Chinese-American family line hit a wall somewhere between 1882 and 1943, and never find out why the record stops exactly there. If someone in your life is looking at that same wall right now, send this to them. The interrogation transcripts are partially digitized, and the trail is more recoverable than most families know. Maybe the interrogation system at Angel Island was simply a rigorous but fair effort to verify eligibility in the absence of reliable documentation. If this were the whole picture, inspectors doing their best with limited records, asking detailed questions to distinguish genuine family relationships from fraudulent ones, the story would be an uncomfortable but defensible piece of immigration enforcement history. But the record refuses to stay that simple. The interrogation questions used at Angel Island were not designed to verify identity. They were designed to fail applicants. This is not an inference. It is documented in the internal correspondence of the Bureau of Immigration itself. Inspectors who worked at Angel Island during the 1910s and 1920s wrote to their supervisors about the design of the interrogation process. The correspondence, portions of which are held at the National Archives in San Bruno, California, describes a deliberate effort to identify questions that genuine family members would answer differently, because genuine families do not memorize their domestic arrangements with the precision that coaching papers require. The logic was inverted. A coached applicant who had memorized a coaching paper would answer consistently. A genuine family member, answering from lived memory, would introduce the natural variation and inconsistency of real experience. The interrogation was designed so that truth looked like coaching, and coaching looked like truth. Archival patterns suggest the rejection rate at Angel Island for Chinese applicants ran significantly higher than rejection rates at other American ports of entry during the same period. Not because Chinese applicants were less eligible, but because the interrogation system they faced was not the same system. The record is silent on whether this disparity was ever formally reviewed by the Bureau of Immigration. The poetry on the walls is where the record becomes impossible to read neutrally. While detainees waited days, weeks, months for their cases to be adjudicated, they carved poems into the wooden walls of the barracks. The poems are in classical Chinese form. They describe the crossing, the detention, the humiliation of the interrogation, the fear of deportation. They were carved with whatever was available: a nail, a chopstick, a sharpened piece of wire. They are still there. The National Park Service has documented and translated more than 200 of them. One line, translated by historians who have worked with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, reads, "The barbarian's interrogation is not one of justice. It is a test designed for us to fail." This is not a later interpretation of the detention experience. It is a contemporary account carved into the wall of the facility by someone who was living through it. The coaching paper system. The paper-son documentation that families prepared before departure is documented from both sides of the interrogation table. The National Archives in San Bruno holds not only the interrogation transcripts, but the coaching papers themselves. Confiscated documents that inspectors seized from arriving passengers, filed as evidence of fraud, and preserved in the same archive as the transcripts they were meant to defeat. Reading the coaching papers alongside the interrogation transcripts produces a specific and verifiable finding. In case after case, the coaching papers were not detained for a study. The source of interrogation failures. The questions that produced inconsistent answers were not the questions the coaching papers had prepared applicants for. They were questions the inspectors had introduced. After the coaching paper system became known, questions specifically calibrated to the gaps in what coaching papers typically covered. The Bureau of Immigration knew about coaching papers by the mid-1910s. Confiscated examples had been in the archive for years. The Inspector Corps at Angel Island had studied them, and the interrogation protocol had been adjusted in response, not to make verification more accurate, but to identify questions that coaching papers could not prepare applicants for. The system was not trying to find the truth. It was trying to find the questions the truth could not answer. 2. And then there is the matter of the 1940 fire. On August 12, 1940, a fire broke out in the administration building of the Angel Island Immigration Station. The building burned. The records stored inside it, case files, interrogation transcripts, administrative correspondence, were damaged. Some were destroyed. The official account describes the fire as accidental. An investigation was conducted. The cause was recorded as electrical. What the record shows about what was lost is less precise than what the record shows about the fire itself. The inventory of destroyed materials was not comprehensive. Historians who have worked with the Angel Island Archive note that the case files most affected by the fire were concentrated in specific years that correspond to periods of particularly high rejection rates, and to the period when the adjusted interrogation protocol was most actively in use. This does not prove the fire was deliberate. What it does establish is that the records most likely to document the gap between the interrogation system's stated purpose and its actual design are the records that burned. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different archive, one where the records survived, and what they contain is more specific than anyone has publicly assembled. The detention barracks were condemned by the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1940, the same year as the fire. The station closed formally in 1963. The state of California acquired the island in 1963. The barracks were scheduled for demolition in 1970. A state park employee named Alexander Weiss, conducting a survey of the buildings before demolition, found the poems carved into the walls. He reported them. The demolition was halted. The poems survived because one person looked before the building came down. The interrogation transcripts survived because they were stored in a different building than the one that burned. The coaching papers survived because inspectors filed them as evidence rather than destroying them. The archive did not intend to preserve what it preserved. It preserved it anyway, imperfectly, unevenly, with gaps that follow a pattern the record cannot fully explain. The wall was supposed to be torn down. See, the poems were supposed to go with it. The interrogation transcripts are searchable. That is the specific fact that changes what this history means for anyone with a Chinese-American family line that goes quiet somewhere between 1882 and 1943. The National Archives in San Bruno holds the Angel Island case files that survived the 1940 fire. Organized by name, by year of arrival, by case outcome. The Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation has been working to digitize and index them. The transcripts contain the questions. They contain the answers. They contain the inspector's margin notes and the final determination. For a family trying to understand why a great-grandparent's entry record looks the way it does, why the answers seem rehearsed, why the file contains a coaching paper alongside the transcript, why the case was approved on appeal after an initial rejection, the archive is not silent. It is specific. It is recoverable. What it cannot recover is the cases that burned in 1940, the families whose paper trail ends at Angel Island and does not resume, whose ancestor was deported or died in detention or was turned back at the dock before a file was even opened. Those families face a gap the archive cannot close, not because the history did not happen, because the record that would have documented it is gone. The Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. The Angel Island station closed 20 years later. The poems on the walls have been translated, documented, published. The history is not hidden. What remains hidden, what the archive preserves only in outline, is the interior of the system. The conversations between inspectors about which questions to add, the memos about rejection rate targets, the administrative logic that produced an interrogation designed to find the questions that truth could not answer. Those documents may still exist, in a different filing cabinet, in a different archive, under a different classification. The interrogation is over. The questions are still open.